Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. I want to talk today a little bit about Canada becoming the 51st state. Lots of talk about that over the last number of months. Now, I think it's pretty unlikely for something like that to happen. However, what about Alberta? Either becoming the 51st state or perhaps a sovereign nation on its own. Now, is that a possibility? That's maybe more of a likelihood, and I want to talk about that today with our guest, Dr. Michael Wagner. He's written a book on this. He's an independent researcher and a writer with a PhD in political science, and the author of No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. That's available online at drmichaelwagner.com, so drmichaelwagner.com. Great to have you with us, Michael.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say on this. By the way, I ran into a friend of mine who's an attorney the other day, and he was saying that he's read your book, and he thinks it should be mandatory reading for all high school students in Alberta. So there you go. You got an endorsement on that.
Oh,
So
thank you for
listen,
saying that.
yeah, it's good to hear. You bet. And no, Canada is the 51st state, right? We're hearing all kinds of stuff about that, and then there's jokes about going back and forth on that. So, I mean, presently that kind of talk gets a lot of Canadians upset, and understandably so. But, here in Western Canada, especially in Alberta, there's a lot of people thinking that's maybe not such a bad idea. So, what is it that makes, the idea of Alberta being part of the USA an attractive idea?
Well, there's probably a few different things. Like one is the historic uh, discontent in Alberta with the way we've been treated by Ottawa. Like many Albertans for several decades have felt that we've been mistreated, and I agree with that. Um, and some of them think then we would have a better deal if we went to the United States and joined the United States. They think we would have, you know, more control over our own destiny and more economic opportunities and things like that. Like I actually personally don't agree with the idea of joining the United States as Alberta, but I think there's a very strong argument for Alberta becoming independent, like I mentioned in that book. So because especially since the time of Pierre Trudeau, Albertans have been discontent with their place within Canada. Like when you look back historically, the prairie provinces have had problems and discontents with the federal government since the early 1900s, if not earlier. And there were various protest movements over the time, like the 1920s, we had what was called the Progressive Party, and then we had the Social Credit Party. There's been various movements, over time that show Western discontent with Ottawa. But none of those movements advocated becoming independent of Canada. They just wanted to reform Canada or make the situation better within Canada. And it wasn't really until Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in the late 1960s when we first saw real discussions begin about Alberta or Western Canada becoming an independent country. And so the very first organizations promoting that idea began at around 1970 or so. That was, as I mentioned, after Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. The first thing he did that made some Westerners angry was the Official Languages Act, which made French much more prominent in Western Canada. Like a lot of people in the prairies saw that as kind of almost a cultural imperialism, having French put on our, cereal boxes and signs and things like that. I mean, it's not really a big deal. So it wasn't like that caused a huge stir in the population, but that made some people very uncomfortable with Pierre Trudeau. And that's when people started talking about the independence idea. But it was in 1973 when things really changed because there was a war in the Middle East. And the price of oil skyrocketed in just a matter of weeks, from around $3 a barrel to $11 or $12 a barrel just in a few weeks. So Alberta's oil resources, which had been very helpful for Alberta up to that time, suddenly became a huge treasure. And it became worth much more than anybody had understood before. And so Pierre Trudeau put in an export tax on oil so that when Alberta exported oil to the United States, which it did, much of that revenue would go to the federal government instead of Alberta, because under the Canadian Constitution, natural resources are owned by the provinces. So that money should have gone to Alberta, and it was going to the federal government. And also Trudeau instituted a low price on oil for within Canada. So if Alberta sold oil within Canada, it would not get the world price. It would get about half or two-thirds the world price. And if it sold to the United States, much of the revenue would go to the federal government. So Alberta was losing whether it sold the oil within or within Canada or exported it. And so this was kind of the origin of people being very angry, especially within Alberta, at what's going on. And then, those policies progressed during the 1970s. Peter Lougheed fought very hard for Alberta. And it got actually worse in 1980 with the National Energy Program, when Pierre Trudeau was reelected in 1980. And he brought in this new policy of federal control to a large degree over the oil industry in Western Canada, and that created a huge upsurge in support for independence. And it even led to, in 1982, there was a by-election in the old Didsbury constituency in Alberta, and a separatist candidate was elected. It was the only time, a separatist candidate had ever been elected
Wow.
in Western Canada. And this
Wow.
was, that's just kind of the initial story of Alberta independence. But so from the time that Pierre Trudeau became prime minister until today, with not consistently during that time, but up and down, there's waves of
Yeah.
support for that during the time. There's been this, real anxiety about Alberta's relationship with Canada. And so some of the people who feel that look to the United States as a better alternative. Now, I
Right.
think
You're suggesting that it isn't necessarily all it's cut out to be, though, that alternative, if we were to be absorbed by the U.S. or to merge with them, whatever. You're saying because of the way their government is set up, the independent states, and how many rights would we have as compared to here in Canada?
yeah, like I think there would be economic benefits to joining the United States, at least in the short term. But
Hmm.
realistically, the way that we're ignored in the federal government in Ottawa right now, we would also be ignored in Washington D.C. if we were part of the United States, because we're just a small province in terms of our population. We wouldn't have a lot of voting power, and so our voice would not be heard. So, like I say, in the short term, there would probably be some economic benefits. Maybe in the long term, it's so hard to predict, right? But eventually there will be a different president, and eventually there'll be different politicians in power, and we do not know what their policies will be towards economic development and towards oil development. If you remember, Joe Biden was not favorable to oil development. We could
Yeah.
easily end up with another president like that. You know what I mean? So I think that a lot of Canadians or Albertans who look to the United States as a solution to our problems, I think they have an idealistic view of what the United States is and what it's been. It's
Hmm.
always easy to see the grass is always greener on the other side. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
almost looks
that's
that way until you get there. Maybe it's not quite as sweet as you thought it was, right? So,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So, but as you described, though, there was a sense of alienation. So we have this Western alienation thing happening here, always kind of simmering under the surface there, and we're going, man, we're getting a raw deal here. This is not just all this oil revenue that should be staying here in Alberta. It's not. It's going elsewhere, and so you have this. Hey, we want in, right? That was the Reform Party's message for many years, and well, I don't know. Are we in? When you you listen to the coffee shop talk around Alberta, I don't think we feel that we're in.
No, no, absolutely. Like the Reform Party was a really great idea for its time, because that was after the first wave of the independence movement. And Preston Manning, had a really good idea. He said, let's take this energy, this, alienation, and let's put it into a political movement to get Western voices into the national government. I mean, that is a superb idea. And I mean, he got lots of support, so dozens and dozens of MPs from Western Canada, especially Alberta, were sent to Ottawa, and they tried so hard, I think that was the right idea. I think they were doing the right thing, but again, they run up against the Canadian political system, which is Ontario and Quebec have the majority of the population, so rightfully they have the majority control in the country. And when you have some MPs from Western Canada come and say, look, we want some changes to our political system so that our voice can be heard, the politicians from Ontario and Quebec can say no, and there's no consequences to them because they can still maintain power that way. So that was what the Reform Party ran up against. It was such a good idea. They did such a good job. The West did want in, but the West wasn't let in. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
eventually, Stephen Harper, who was one of the original members of Parliament for the Reform Party, he eventually became Prime Minister, and he too, he was sincerely wanting to do what was best for Western Canada, and he tried very hard to get Senate reform. That's something else we can talk about. Um, Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, and he would put forth bills into the House of Commons and the Senate to try and get Senate reform, but they couldn't pass. He couldn't get the kinds of reforms that were needed. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so it's kind of frustrating because if the Prime Minister from Calgary, who's in favor of Western interests, can't make the kind of changes the West needs, who could do it then if not the Prime Minister? You know what I mean? So That's
Yeah.
kind of the line of argument. That's the line of argumentation I use. That with the Reform Party, with the Senate Reform Movement, with Stephen Harper, we've tried so many things to make the country more accessible for Western Canadians and to have our voice heard, and yet the door is closed every time. And
That's
so at
that's
some
why you're
point,
saying there's no other option, right? The name of your book, No Other
exactly.
Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. And again, if you're just tuning in, you can get that book at drmichaelwagner.com. You bring up I think you have a whole chapter on it, that we often in the West would see the Conservative Party as, part of the answer here. So we have Pierre Poilievre, potentially, becoming the next prime minister. The polls are, still favorable towards that, although time will tell here. And, is he going to be the savior for Western Canada? And as you put it, the odds are stacked against that because of the way the population is, and again the way the federal seats are allotted across the country. The West might vote this way, but Quebec and Ontario, if they see things differently, if they don't want an oil pipeline coast to coast, then we ain't going to get one, right? Because it's just stacked against us, right?
Pierre Poilievre might very well, want to do good things for Western Canada, but his hands are tied by the political system. And that's why, he's been asked recently about the equalization program, which has been, many Albertans are concerned about the equalization program, that so much of our money is transferred out of our province and sent to Quebec. And he said he would make very minor changes, if any. So he has to support the equalization program as it is. He also mentioned he wants to keep Canada in the Paris Accord, which is commits Canada to various climate change policies that are also not beneficial to Alberta. And he's also come out against the Alberta pension plan. Now, he has to come out against these things. Like, it's not that it's because Central Canada does not favor, equalization reform. It does not favor pulling out of the Paris Accord or an Alberta pension plan. So he has to support those kinds of things as a way of maintaining his support, in places like Toronto and Montreal. He doesn't really have a choice about that. And so it's the political system itself that does that. So, we have many Conservative MPs in the West in Alberta who are really good guys, and they would do things better for Alberta if they could. But the political system ties their hands, and so they're not able to. And that's what's so unfortunate, you know what I mean, in looking
Yeah,
to the
because if
federal
you do
level.
some of these things, then you essentially won't be reelected in the next federal election, and then you're even worse off than you were before, right? So again, you're very limited in how much you can actually accomplish when it comes to getting some of the West's desires to come into fruition here. So that's why, again, you're saying it's the only option we have is to separate if we want to see the West fully prosper there. So, and equalization payments, I think I saw in your book that it was over $600 billion since 1965 that Alberta has given to the rest of Canada. Was that the number?
Yeah, well, it's not just equalization. See, there's several programs, and so it's easier to refer to fiscal transfers. Like there's a health transfer and a social transfer. So all together with the equalization program, Robert Manzel of the University of Calgary calculated that from 1965 until 2018, Alberta had made a net transfer of $630 billion. So that's equalization plus those other programs. So he prefers to use the term fiscal transfers to accommodate all those things together. But yes, it's a very, very large amount of money.
Wow. Okay. Now, there's a certain percentage of Albertans who would say, yes, we want to separate. But, you write about it in the book as well. If we took a referendum on it today, you would lose by a hefty margin. There wouldn't be enough support there to say, yes, let's do it, right?
Yeah.
So, what would it take, I guess? I'm not sure. Do you have any numbers right now currently? Where is Alberta at as far as, if we had a referendum happening on it today, what percentage would say, yes, let's pull the trigger, let's get rid of Canada, be our own nation? Where are we at there?
Well, there was a survey done, I think, in December that had Alberta, like about 38% of Albertans saying they think Alberta would be better off as an independent country. So
38%?
that's 38%, yeah. Yeah, it was higher than what they had in Quebec. Yeah.
Wow, that's actually pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is.
If you're separatist, that would be encouraging, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, what would it take? I guess. There would have to be a referendum. I'm assuming,
Yes.
and so you'd have to have over 50%. I don't know if it's 50, 0.1 or whatever the tipping point would be. And you write as well in your book about, to make that happen, you would need somebody to be a very charismatic, strong leader that people could, get on board with and follow, have confidence in following this person. I don't think that's Danielle Smith. I don't think she's a separatist, for example, but, maybe there's somebody out there. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I don't know of anybody right now, and I don't know of anybody in the movement who knows of someone like that. But ever since the early '70s, every once in a while, someone will say the only thing that would be necessary for the separatist movement to get strong would be a particular leader, like a prominent leader that's very respectable. This actually is what happened in Quebec, because Quebec, the separatist movement there was quite disorganized until René Lévesque came forward. He had been a liberal provincial cabinet minister, very respected in the province. So when René Lévesque came forward, the movement came in behind him, and that's how they achieved their success. And even in Alberta history, like when we look at the successful political movements in history, and I think of William Aberhart, who created the social credit movement. He was a very respected leader, and that movement would never have started without him. He was a key central figure to that movement. Also, when you think of the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta, it was a party with no seats in the legislature when Peter Lougheed took it over in 1965, and 6 years later it formed the government.
Wow.
So sometimes there's particular individuals who are very gifted, and they're able to pull a movement together. And if someone along those lines came out in favor of Alberta independence, that's what it would probably take to get the movement to be successful.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And when you realistically think about it, if Pierre Poilievre wins the next election, probably you'll see a drop in support for separatism, because we'll put some faith in the conservative government that they may help Alberta. Again, as you point out, probably not, because of the way things are set up. If you want to stay in power, you're going to have to, keep the people in Ontario and Quebec happy, not so much in Alberta. So we get taken for granted, I think. But, if Mark Carney ends up winning somehow, these things are possible. Then you'd see probably a big rise in support for Alberta separatism once again. So who knows what'll happen with this here. But yeah, certainly we want to see some justice here. You talk about Alberta values. For example, Prime Minister Trudeau has said, Canada's a post-national state. We don't have a core identity. Our values are, we're not American, Okay, wow. That makes us Canadian. Okay. So what would Alberta's values be? And it ties in somewhat with our history, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, Alberta has a somewhat unique history compared to the rest of Canada. Part of that is because, in the early decades of the province's history, a large percentage of our population was actually American-born. We had a very large intake of American immigrants, so that at one point, I think it might have been about 1920, somewhere around 22% of the Alberta population was American-born. Wow. So these people who came to Alberta, they would have had American culture and identity, and they kind of brought that to Alberta and made so Alberta was more American, if you want, in that sense, than the rest of Canada. They brought other ideas with them. Also, the distinct political movements within Alberta, when you think of the Social Credit Party itself, Alberta was the heartland of the social credit movement in all of Canada. It was founded here. It lasted longer here. It was in power here from 1935 until 1971. And the ideals of the social credit movement itself helped to shape Alberta identity. When you think about it, William Aberhart was a radio preacher. That's how he became known, and he was elected premier until 1943. And when he passed away, he was replaced by Ernest Manning, who was also a radio preacher who took over William Aberhart's ministry. So throughout the time that Ernest Manning was premier, from 1943 to 1968, he was premier and a radio preacher at the exact same time. And he took his radio program across Canada. So you'd have a premier who was Alberta's longest serving premier and the second longest in Canadian history, who never lost an election. That's how popular he was here. And yet, during the day, he's a premier, and during the weekends, he was a radio preacher, and his radio program stretched across Canada from coast to coast. So people in Ontario and other provinces would be hearing Alberta's premier preaching the gospel on the weekends. And this was popular and okay in Alberta. You know what I mean? So
that's incredible. And you think about that compared to where we're at today. That's mind-boggling.
Yep.
It's just,
Yep.
wow. Is that within the realm of possibility to ever see something like that return? Maybe the closest we've come is, somebody like Stockwell Day, right? And of course
Yes.
he got,
Yes.
mocked and ridiculed for his faith
Yeah.
beliefs. But, great politician, really. And I think he earned a lot of respect over the years as well once people got to know him. So
Yes.
who knows? My, oh my, oh my. Well, speaking of spiritual things, let me ask you, it may sound like an odd question, but from a spiritual perspective, right? You're a believer, I'm a believer, most of our viewers are Christians. So God loves unity, right? He loves Canada. I firmly believe that. He's against divorce, for example. And so, would God, in theory, want Canada to stay together because he loves unity, and if you put things together, we shouldn't put it asunder, right? Or are we somehow at a place now where one of the partners in this, covenant of Canada actually broke the covenant and, committed adultery, so to speak, right? Was unfaithful to the partner here, so thereby allowing a legal divorce to take place. Your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a lot of political issues that the Bible speaks to directly, to do with abortion and same-sex marriage, and this is not one of those issues. The Bible doesn't speak directly to whether Canada should remain a united country. The way I look at it is in Canadian constitutional law, based on a Supreme Court decision in 1998 called the Quebec Secession Reference. That Supreme Court decision laid out a legal and constitutionally legal path for a province to become independent. It was dealing specifically with Quebec, but it applies to all the provinces, that if a province holds a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority votes in favor of independence, then the federal government has an obligation to negotiate that province's independence. Then that was 1998. In the year 2000, the federal parliament passed the Clarity Act, which spells out the details of that. So in Canadian constitutional law and in legislation, a province has the democratic right, if it wants, through a referendum to take another path to become an independent country. So from a Christian perspective, I think that as long as it's constitutional and it's legal, I think a Christian should be able to support that because, it's within Canada's law. And so from my perspective, I think a Christian could legitimately support independence as I do. I also think a Christian could legitimately oppose independence because I don't think it's, clearly a scriptural issue per se. I think it's a matter of prudence. We have to look at, how Alberta is being treated. And some people will have a higher tolerance than others. You know what I mean? So I don't think that should be an issue that should divide Christians per se, because I don't see it like when it comes to something like abortion, there's a clear Christian position. It's you're a Christian position or you're not, but this is
Yeah.
not one of those issues. And so we have to give leeway in my perspective, as to how Christians would address this issue.
Well, wouldn't it be something if we had, a province, Alberta, becoming its own nation and actually having pro-life laws in place? I'd be very, very pumped about something like that. I really would. So, I mean, again, so the process itself, you'd have to come to a referendum with a majority on that, and then there'd be some steps to take with the federal government as to how to part. I don't know. What kind of structures do we get to keep? What money has Alberta put in that they can take along with us, sort of thing, if we were to depart. There are some practical questions as well, even like being landlocked, right? So, would we have access to tide water, right, to the oceans to export things and so forth? What kind of currency would we use? Would we have our own currency? Would we stick with the Canadian dollar or go with the U.S. dollar or who knows what? Forming a military, a central bank, I mean, you name it. There's all kinds of practical things that we'd have to get put in place, right?
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, some of that would take place during our negotiations with the federal government. And I just want to emphasize too, if there's a successful referendum for independence in Alberta, the obligation on the federal government is to negotiate toward that independence, but it wouldn't necessarily guarantee independence because the federal government could just come forward with a better deal for Alberta. They could say, okay, we understand that you've, obviously through this vote, we see that you're very discontent, but we'll be willing to make these changes if you'll stay in. So I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Dennis Modry, but he encourages people who just want to improve Canada to vote in favor of independence because it doesn't guarantee the independence. And that's one possible outcome. But another possible outcome would just be a restructuring of Canada in a way that would satisfy Albertans so Albertans wouldn't want to leave. The referendum leads for sure to negotiations and possibly to independence, but also possibly to a reformed Canada. So we don't really know what the
It's
outcome
very
is.
interesting. We'd almost become a little bit like another Quebec, right? Only it would be Alberta this time. And, would Is it possible that Alberta would, get some equalization payments coming our way or something like that, right? Wouldn't that be something? I don't know if there's any stranger things that have happened than something like that, but um, yeah. So you're saying, hey, it's worth voting in favor of it because Alberta would simply benefit one way or the other?
Yeah, in a sense, because like I say, with the Reform Party and Senate reform, we tried to change the country. We tried to make it better, and they would ignore us. They wouldn't make any of the changes that we wanted. But having a successful referendum would give us leverage. Now we would have, cards to play, so to speak. We'd have something to give to them if they wanted to, accommodate us, so to speak, rather than us pulling out. So it'd be a way of giving Alberta leverage to negotiate, serious leverage, rather than just asking for,
Yeah.
favors from them,
Yeah.
and they can deny us.
Well, how would we? I guess, because you'd like to see this happen, right? No other option, right? You want to BC, Alberta as independent, but what would it take to get a referendum? Now, if we got numbers like 38% in that poll, how would you get the provincial government, which currently would not be in favor of separation, to actually say, we're going to put this on the next, provincial election? Do you want a referendum?
No, that's an excellent question, and it comes down to what we call the wave theory. Like this is something that Preston Manning pointed out that every so often in Western history, Western political history, you get a wave of support for something. Like even those what I mentioned earlier, the Progressive Party, the Social Credit Party, and he actually wrote a wave of support for the Reform Party. There was a huge wave of support for the Reform Party. That was because in 1986, the Mulroney government, Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative government, held a competition for the contract to maintain Canada's CF-18 fighter jets, which were new at the time. There was only two cities in Canada that could maintain those jets, Winnipeg and Montreal. The government held a competition, and Winnipeg won that competition, and the government awarded it to Montreal. And there was such a wave of anger in Western Canada that was the main
So,
thing that
so,
started
so
the
I'm hearing
Reform
you right.
Party.
Basically, there has to be some sort of wave that takes place that rises people's, the hair in their neck starts to rise, and they're going, "We need to do something." All right.
Yes,
I'm out of time
yes.
here. A very interesting conversation, Dr. Wagner. So thanks for sharing with us today.
Thanks for having
Okay.
me on. It's good to
You
talk to
you
you.
bet. drmichaelwagner.com. The book is No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. All right. Love for you to hit subscribe. It's wiseup.ca.